This is the second session on the end of pearling in the Gulf. As Omar has mentioned, we held one session in Doha. And so it's for thousands of years, the finest pearls were famous to be brought from to be found or fished in the Gulf. It provided work, wealth, and identity for the region, but also not only that, but also has brought much of influences in music and to the culture and to even maybe to habits. And then when the Japanese Mikimoto Kōkichi developed the first artificially cultivated, cultured pearl at the end of 19th century, this the whole culture and the industry of fish pearling in the Gulf and maybe in the world has gone to, or had started to end somehow. So it's a great period of economic strife ensured, and it's going to be discussed. I mean, this topic is going to be discussed by Butheina Kazim and Frauke Heard-Bey. And Frauke is a historian and political scientist who specializes in social and political development of the Gulf. She worked for 39 years at the Center for Documentation and Research in Abu Dhabi. Her research resulted in several publications, including from crucial states to United Arab Emirates. And Butheina Kazim has recently completed her Fulbright scholarship in media culture and communication in New York University. And she's a regular commentator on issues of media, culture, and communication with articles published on Al Jazeera, English, Gulf News, and Jadaliyya. And she's also an active member of various organizations and independent initiatives that promote pro-social and humanitarian activities. Please join us in welcoming Butheina and Frauke to the panel.
Can you all hear me? So, Dr. Heard-Bey, Frauke, thank you for joining me on the stage of what I've slowly come to think of as the theater of history, where we're navigating and trying to narrate moments in the formation of the UAE that have defined the place, the history, the people, and really the idea. So I would like to start by drawing the curtains at around 1850. A moment which is considered the epitome of the pearling era's golden age. Can you walk us through why that was such an important point in time for pearling here on the Trucial Coast?
Yes, in fact, we can make it even more precise. 1853 was when the various tribal rulers of the Trucial states, they were called the Trucial rulers, agreed to make an agreement with the government of India to not ever again go to war with each other on the open sea. And well, they also engaged in a few other, there were other points as well, but for the purpose of the pearling, it is the most important thing to see that through this, the end point really of a series of agreements between these rulers and the government of India meant that for this industry, which had slowly become very important for all the people living on the Trucial Coast, that this industry could be conducted in peace, because before there was a lot of raiding and mutual disturbance. And in 1853, that finally came to an end. And the societies of all the Trucial states, and maybe for some of you who are not familiar with this area, I will mention some of the places, which is of course Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, that not many people know, and Ras Al Khaimah, and also Fujairah, which only became a trucial state in 1952. So the people living on the Gulf shore became more and more dependent on the pearling. And why is that? Pearls do not have any intrinsic value, not like silver or gold. Pearls are no use to anyone unless you want to adorn yourself with pearls. And increasingly, people wanted to adorn themselves. And we see this on this accumulation of pictures that everywhere in the world, this is the Indian scene, and you can see how many pearls an important Maharaja needed to have around his neck so that everybody could see how wealthy and important he was. And this attachment to pearls as a sign of wealth and importance transmitted itself quite easily to the British, to the British people in India, who themselves also exported this fascination with pearls to the rest of Europe and ultimately to America even. But the point we have to make here is that the pearling industry and everything that goes with it depends on the market. And if nobody wants to buy these pearls, if these families become impoverished, then there is no market for the pearls. So we have to keep this in mind all the time. So in the first instance, in 1853, there was security and there was a possibility to really exploit this industry to the very to the levels that one could possibly exploit it. And that meant that throughout the end of the 19th century, this industry seemed to grow every year, and one got accustomed to this feeling that next year there would be more takings, there would be more money, next year more pearls would be found, more ships participate, and at the height of the pearling industry, it is documented that about 1,200 ships departed from all the ports of the trucial states into the sea, and they then stayed offshore for about 4 months. This depended on it changed slightly through the decades, but we have to also bear in mind that the people who were involved in this industry offshore were away from home for 4 months, and other times of the year for shorter periods.
And I want to spend some time trying to understand all these different players in this sort of in this trajectory, in this very complicated and rather, to use your words, fragile industry. And I want to move to start off. This is a picture of Jacques Cartier in 1911 with Indian pearl and gemstone merchants who were very active and important players in this ecosystem. Can you walk us through some of the important players in this very complicated, interdependent trade?
Yes. Maybe I will start down here with the British and the rulers. Just to recap what I said before, the industry could flourish because there was peace on the sea, and the rulers agreed because everybody could see that the pearling industry was the most important resource for the population. Then we have to move to maybe the financiers is an important idea that one has to bear in mind, that industries need investment. And certainly the pearling industry is not something where these people swam out and dived down. The pearling industry needed enormous amounts of investment. And what for? Well, the ships had to be seaworthy. There is on the shore, for instance, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and so on, you don't find any wood that would be worth using to build ships. So the wood had to be imported. So you have to finance getting the wood from either India or East Africa. That's the first thing. Or you import ready-made boats or ships. but mostly they were made in Ajman and Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So you need to build these boats. You need to pay the people who build the boats. Then when the boats are built, you need to equip them for 4 months out on sea. You need to equip them with the food for the crew, rice and coffee, important, kahwa, and also water. But they did put in, on various islands, particularly Dalma, to fetch some water. But the point is, it is a lot of money up front before any pearl has been found and sold. So in the first instance, in the dim and distant past, some tribal people just put their hands together and as sort of groups, tribal groups, organized some diving and got some ships. But in the time that we are talking about now, the late 19th and the early 20th century, we had these serious finance people who would put up the money for getting the boats and kitting them out. And these financiers would be either pearl merchants who had already made a lot of money and had money spared to offer, to lend it to other people, or indeed to finance yet another ship for themselves. And also in some places, the Indian merchants, to whom I will turn in a moment, they also were able to pre-finance. But that meant that, and some other, in some other instances, also the captains themselves, another layer of actors, so to speak. Captains also, in some cases, made enough money in 1 year to be able to say, I finance my own ship, and in this respect, they were like the financiers and the captain in one person. Important, of course, without doubt, is of course are the divers, and they are the more, in some ways, they are the most important people of the crew, of course, on the ship. But a diver can never do his job without the help of the hauler. We call it the sib up there, the lifter, it's the hauler. Because when the diver is down below, every second counts. And to go themselves up takes too much time, so they spend more time down, and they tug on a line. Well, first they descend on a line which is weighted with a stone, and to go down quickly, and then they come up, tugging on this line, and the man on top holds the person up immediately, and that is a very important function. Yet, the diver, of course, earns more than the hauler, because the diver is putting also his health on the line, and sometimes risk their life as well.
Frauke, where did these people come from? Where did the divers and the crew, where were they sourced from? Where did they? Yes,
the divers and the crew and the lift, they were originally, of course, mostly people, tribal people from the hinterland, or who had already been settled on the coast of the Trucial States. However, at the height of the pearling industry's boom time, there weren't enough hands to do all this. There were more and more boats were kitted out, and so one was looking for more people. And for instance, people from the opposite shore, and particularly from Baluchistan and so on, they at that time life was very, very hard in that part. So they came almost voluntarily to the Trucial Coast to participate in the diving. But also, a large proportion of the people who were engaged on shore, on the boats, were slaves. And they were people from East Africa who had been brought over in order to be employed by the owners of boats and by the captains. And in that case, whatever was distributed at the end of the dive to all the participants. The money that went to the slave people then went to their owners, whereas the free divers, they took the money home. But by the time by the turn of the century, there were very few slave people enslaved, but the people still lived on the coast, and they were still diving for pearls like before, and nothing had happened, had changed for them, because also where would they go to? Their livelihood and also their relationships were on the neutral states, and they stayed.
What about the people on ground? What kind of role did they play? Because there's a sense that everybody went on the ships and left out, and for 6 months out of the year, it was just sleepy villages and women waving to them from the coast. And that was a very inaccurate depiction.
It's an inaccurate picture, but of course in some cases it also might have been true. The waving on that certainly, I mean, that the women were anxiously waiting for the fleet to come back. And the fleet actually, it wasn't that individual ships sort of said, we have had enough, or we found enough pearls, we now go home. That was not. The season of being offshore was strictly regulated by, in some ports, by an admiral of the fleet, and in other ports by the ruler himself, who would dictate when the ships depart and when they should come back. And it was always, they all come back together. But the people on shore, of course, they continued with their life. And in the early part of the 19th century and before, many of the divers who actually came from the hinterland would leave their families, for instance, in the Liwa, which is a group of 36 or so settlements deep in Abu Dhabi territory, deep on the border, on the edge of the empty quarter, deep in the desert.
So it wasn't an exclusively pearling-oriented economy. There were still other aspects that benefited from the prosperity.
Yes, yes. And of course, the more prosperous the society became, the more also, as we all know, there are then desires and luxury goods that one would want. And so first I have to maybe turn to the merchants themselves, which are the people to whom these pearls were sold. And sometimes they were sold already while the fleet was offshore, and the tawash.
The conversation about pearling and the ecosystem and the intricacy of it cannot be had without a conversation about debt and the debt structure, which is something that, us being here in the city of Dubai, have had some experience with in the contemporary time. How did that cycle work, and what did it mean leading towards the collapse of the pearling industry in the early 20th century?
Yeah, certainly. Where there's investment, there are people who invest in something where they haven't the guarantee that there will be a good return. And as the industry became more and more promised every year would be better, because more and more people risked putting more money into this industry. And that was, let's say, voluntary. They put it in because they thought they would make a good profit. But there were, of course, other people in this cycle who could not. It wasn't voluntary that they were in debt, and that was the divers and the haulers, and there were one or two other people on board, some mutawa and some young helpers. But these people had to make sure that their families on shore had something to live off while they were away. And as time progressed, fewer of these people actually had assets in the desert that they could live off entirely, while the men were on sea. But it became eventually a must, which was even written down, that a captain had to give a certain amount to all the crew, every one of them, at a certain time, sort of so many weeks before the beginning of the dive, and then another item of money at another time before they departed. And this money had to be given even if the diver or the hauler didn't want it and didn't want to get further into debt. Because
so they were caught up in a cycle.
What happened very often exactly was that at the end of the dive, there wasn't enough money if each and every participant did not make as much money as they had received from the captain in the first place. So that person was in debt to the captain. That also meant he couldn't offer his services, his work, to any other captain on any other ship. He had to go back the next season to that captain to whom he still owed money. And this cycle then continued, and in some families it was really such a bind, and there was, they couldn't get out of it, that even if somebody died, his son then was bound to dive for the captain to whom his father was indebted. And that situation, one can imagine, also meant a lot of litigation and problems, because most of all these people couldn't read or write, and the captains often just jotted something on a piece of paper, but in some cases it was spoken only. One had the confidence that the captain was honest and had everything in his head as well. So there were disputes when people were in dire straits, and in all these ports there was a separate kind of jurisdiction, and that was the Salifat al-Ghos, which is the divers' court, where members of all the different strata in the diving industry were represented to make it a fair thing. And it was not the ruler who decided ultimately, but it was within this sort of group of people who would decide on these disputes. And some of the debtors, of course, some of these divers who maybe also pride themselves on being really good divers, and they can stay down longer than anyone else. And so, you know, every captain wanted to have the able-bodied and very, very good divers. And so if on occasions one of those really good divers got into deep debt and he felt he was strong enough he just went along the coast, because some of these crucial states were rather close, and there were other principalities in between, like Hamria or Hira, which no longer play a role now, but had a sheikh of some standing at the time. So people actually escaped from the jurisdiction of one ruler and went to and hoped to escape, and then offered their services to some other ruler. And then that led to disputes between the rulers, because they were obliged to bring the person back because there was someone in debt. And often the problem was that ultimately a lot of the debt guarantee at the last instance was in fact by the Indian merchants, the Indian traders. And they were exempt from the local jurisdiction of any kind, be it of the ruler or the traditional jurisdiction, or indeed the Salifat al-Ghos. They were protected by the British Indian government because they were subjects of the British Indian government. So if somebody was indebted to one of those, it became a political issue.
So they were better positioned in this particular cycle. I want to spend some time talking about Mikimoto's intervention. It's the narrative is often that Mikimoto's technological disruption of inventing the Japanese cultural pearl was the reason and the leading factor to the ultimate demise of the pearling industry. Is there truth to that narrative, or is there more to the story?
Certainly, the demise of the bust of the boom, if you like, was accelerated by the marketing of these cultured pearls, which to the uninitiated eye looked more or less looked exactly like the pearls from the Gulf. But there were other factors, and it's difficult to rate which one was more important, but so I just enumerate. And one of the factors was certainly that over speculation, and that at some stage there was so much speculation that things would be better next year, and everybody invested, and this sort of percolated down that one of the big investors, his ship came back without enough pearls, or when the pearls were collected, they didn't find a good market. So he kept the pearls back, hoping that next year would be a good market again. So he put his pearls in a little knot in a red little tissue and kept it. And that was, huge amount of money tied up, and he kept it. And next year it was even worse, the market. So these investors suddenly became no longer in a position to invest any further. And so it percolated down that the involvement of debt upon debt upon debt diminished the ability of the whole system to sustain itself.
What about the global spectrum in terms of the demand on the demand side?
And that was the other factor, yes. And one doesn't know what was more important, but certainly, if we now think, the height was really the turn of the century, 1905, 1910, 1911, still climbing up for some areas anyway, the sale of pearls. And then we have the First World War. And during the First World War, one knows that these wealthy families in Britain, there was, it just wouldn't have been right to go around with lots of pearls and so on. That's, everywhere in Britain, in this case, in Russia and everywhere, luxuries were just not the thing anymore. And therefore, one didn't buy any more pearls. And the pearls one had, one would put in one's box and keep it hidden. And so the market for pearls also decreased because of the First World War. And then, soon after the First World War, we have the depression, the economic depression around the world. And so certainly you don't have your American jewelers coming to Bahrain anymore. Firstly, because they can get just as good pearls from Japan, they think. And secondly, because nobody had the money to pay.
And what did this mean for everybody here? What did it mean for life on the Trucial Coast? That was very heavily dependent on pearling as a commodity, as a livelihood.
Yes.
What did it mean for the people and the stakeholders?
It really meant a decline in the living standard of people. And it was compounded by the fact that many people had actually flocked to the coast, and some families had more or less neglected their holdings, their property in the hinterland. And so they couldn't easily revert to it. Also, many people, of course, did. But others were really in dire straits, and one can only say it was a good fortune that soon after, in the sort of late 20s and early 30s, it became obvious that there were other means of employment, of making money. And that was particularly the oil industry, which was starting up in eastern Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and in Bahrain. The first oil was exported from Bahrain in 1935, and so certainly pearling people in Bahrain had now an alternative to find employment and to feed their families. On the Trucial Coast, that was a long, long way in coming, because the first concession agreements were only signed in the 1930s, between 37 and 39. But because of the intervention then of the Second World War, where nothing happened, the oil companies could not do anything. They had no men, everybody had to go to war. There was no steel and certainly no investment. And so the first activity only started in 1949 following. And so from that time onwards, there were local people could then find employment in the oil industry, and and also there was a little bit of pearling still going on, simply because people knew they could do it, and there was also a possibility you could just wait out in the winter. That is, that was always sort of on the side, and now people did do this. But by and large, people would try to find employment elsewhere. And another means of finding employment was also the military, that the British government was then thought they were, the United Nations sort of made them feel responsible for this part of the world, and they did do a certain amount of developing help and so on. And one thing was to make sure that the countryside was safer than it had become in the sort of 50s. So in 52, a small group, the Trucial States Development, the Trucial States, the Trucial Scouts were developed, and that was a small force where a lot of people found employment and regular payment, and that was very welcome. Why did one actually need a force like this was that things had really become to such a, people had become very, very poor, and some people in the desert who had in the past augmented their income with a very traditional thing, and that was also seen as a fun and something to prove your manhood almost, and to razoo, to actually go and catch somebody else's camels, and then they come and catch your camels and so on. And this was a tit for tat, and that has been going on for centuries. But when there isn't enough to get in this respect, and people still don't really know anything else, there have been incidents where some of the sort of desert-bound tribal people have even come to the outskirts of the cities, of the towns on the coast, and sort of raided the homes of women who, they couldn't defend themselves, and people just took cooking pots and things. I mean, very, very simple, but they were desperate, and this desperation was not, they were not criminals, they were simply desperate and could see that somebody else had just a little more than they had. But this led to a lot of feeling of insecurity, and this feeling of insecurity was finally, the British government sort of responded by founding this...
the Trucial Omani coast?
The Trucial Oman Scouts, which also, it helped to patrol the desert, but it also meant that a lot of people found employment. So it helped on all fronts, possibly.
Frauke, I want to end by sort of contextualizing this period of time in understanding contemporary issues of the UAE. Why is it important to understand in a more nuanced and detailed way, rather than the sort of the nostalgia-laden narrative that we're often sort of exposed to? Why is it important to really know this experience on the Trucial Coast to understand contemporary issues of UAE culture, society, and even identity?
Well, this is a big question, but certainly it is important, first of all, to the people who live here, who come from here, but also for all of us who live here or who come to visit, to contextualize, to understand that there is a very important history has come and gone, or an industry has made its mark and come and gone in this society, in this region. And where one could learn a lot from it. As I said in the beginning, it was an industry that needed a lot of investment, and also a lot of cooperation. No one diver could make any money on his own. He needed the ship, the captain, and the merchant, and the market. And so everybody depended on everybody else. And I think much can be learned from this when we see the next phase of a boom, which in the 70s and 80s, people just on the outside saw the Gulf also as a place where there was nothing but the oil industry and the oil boom, and this makes money, and what next? But again, it is important to see that oil in itself, you can't drink it even. It needs the market and the interdependence, and therefore also to gauge which development is over the top, and which development, and again it goes now with Dubai, which development, which provision of how many housing units are actually needed and what is too much. And this question of how to wisely invest and not overextend an industry which has to be understood with sensitivity in order to be a player in it. I think that is one of the important lessons one could learn. But on a more sort of, I think maybe intimate line, I would also say that if one looks at the development of the pearling industry and how the society, the local society developed in this and also coped with the reduction of the wealth. I've lived here for a very long time, and I must say it is a privilege to see how even in that past people have been able to have tolerance. These areas were always tolerant of all creeds, of all comers, and that this tolerance is, it had to be, people had to be tolerant in the past to welcome these Hindu and other, and all these Khoja and so on, merchants from India, and all the other people who came from other coasts to help in the dive. And this tolerance has transmitted itself to our days, and I think we see it all around us. And this is certainly a lesson that one can learn, that within the Gulf there is this understanding that every ethnicity and every individual has something to give, and if they do, then they also have something to take away.
Frauke, thank you so much for joining us today and taking us through this very important sort of time-traveling journey on this in this moment in time, which is often not interrogated enough. So thank you so much for being here, and it's a pleasure.
Would anyone have any questions, or was that not?
Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions because we are moving on to the 70s, I understand. So we'll take any questions, anybody that wants to talk to Dr. Heard-Bey outside.
Outside, yes.
Thank you.